And if you have the notes, this is talk number 14. If you look at the top of your notes, you'll see it's talk 14 and 15. It's all one piece. And so we'll start today, and at the appropriate point, we'll draw a line and we'll just quit. Let me remind you where we are in the story briefly. I won't draw it. We don't have enough blackboards at this church. Actually, they're whiteboards, aren't they? But you can tell how old I am. They're blackboards to me. And this is actually chalk, isn't it? If we had more blackboards, I would try to draw the story for you. But you know, last week we did that again, and you can go back and see that for you. And we're up to Act 4. They have come out of Egypt by a mighty act of justice. They're at Sinai, and God is now going to reveal himself at Sinai and give them two great institutions, the law and the tabernacle. And those two institutions taken together form the foundation for the society that God will construct on it. And so we're going to look in this series of talks at the law, and then in another series of talks at the tabernacle. And I've given you some readings that I hope you're doing these. Interpreting the law of Moses in the context of the law, codes, or lists in the ancient Near East. So I want to take seriously the social world of the Bible, that is the ancient Near East. And the reason for taking this seriously is that we are in a better place to understand then how the Israelites would have actually understood what God was saying to them by way of comparison and by way of contrast with the other law codes and the other justice traditions in the ancient Near East. So we'll look at those. The law codes, or perhaps it would be better to call them lists, are primarily found in Mesopotamia. Scholars tend to use the word list rather than codes because codes gives the idea of something that's complete. It also gives the idea of something that's systematized. But the lists in Mesopotamia, the most famous of which is the Code of Hammurabi, or the List of Hammurabi. It'd be hard not to call it the Code because that's what we've all grown up with, isn't it? But the List of Hammurabi really is a list. And I sent you the link. You can find it. I hope you went and read the 256 odd laws. And it really is a grocery list. It's simply a list. It is not complete. Some very obvious things are missing there. And when you ask, how are they connected to each other? The answer is, in the same way your spouse does a grocery list. It's stream of consciousness, isn't it? Oh, we need beans, we need bacon, we need spaghetti. You know, you don't organize it, meat, and no, at least we don't, do you? Does anybody organize their grocery list? All right. Yeah, sorry, one person does, thank you. Well, we'll see you after class and ask you to work on the Code of Hammurabi. And also, we might say, the lists in Moses. There are lists in the law of Moses, and the organization of them is not apparent. And a possible explanation is there is no organization. They are simply lists, and they reflect the culture of their day in doing that sort of thing. We will struggle with that at a later sort of time. Now, the Code of Hammurabi is an ideal one to compare and contrast with, and we'll use that because Hammurabi is several hundred years before Moses. So we know that Moses would have had access to this code. He would have known about the code. He would have read this code, and so we're on fairly safe ground when we talk about that code. Now, what I'd like to do in this talk is to begin to talk about the shape of the law in Israel and the shape of the law in the ancient Near East. Now, I realize that shape's a rather odd term, and I'm happy to use it because then I can manipulate it to fit my own needs, all right? So by shape, I have this in mind, that here's the culture of Israel, and in it we're going to have the Mosaic Law, and here is ancient Near East, let's say Mesopotamia, and it will have its lists. The Code of Hammurabi is the most obvious one, and it is interesting that in part some of these laws are actually verbatim. Indeed, the laws about the ox and what happens to an oxen if it gets killed accidentally, and so on and so on and so about the rules about the ox are almost identical in the two lists. All right? And so scholars have started from that sort of thing, or at least maybe not started from it, but looked at it, and then you generate all kinds of interesting questions about who borrowed from whom. Well, obviously, Hammurabi didn't borrow from Moses, did he? Because he's before Moses. Did Moses borrow from Hammurabi? Well, I don't know. We can ask him someday, right? Did they both borrow from a common tradition? That's a possibility, although the wording is so close, you say, wow, what common tradition was that? Now, I'm not going to explore those interesting questions. There are books and books and books written about that to try to explain that. But the important thing here, and the thing that gets missed out, is that while there are similarities, and I'm certainly happy to own those and to work with those, while there are similarities, taken as a whole, and that's really what we want to do, the shape, taken as a whole, that the culture stemming from the law of Moses is radically different than the culture stemming from and controlled by the Code of Hammurabi. So although they may have points in common, when you look at the whole law, they're radically different. And it's that radical difference that I want us to think about, all right? Without ignoring the fact that there are points of commonality. So I'm going to point out 5 areas in which there are major differences. We'll deal with 3 in this lecture probably, and 2 in the next. The first one has to do with genre issues. And I'm going to try to keep a running score up here because, well, this really is a lecture, and I know what that means. It's boring. And I've been given strict instructions not to let you fall asleep, because then you might fall over, bump your head, and sue the church, and we don't want that to happen, all right? So please don't fall asleep in my class. Fall asleep in somebody else's class. And I will try to keep score up here so that you won't get completely lost in this sort of thing. Genre issues. And by genre, we're going to look at 4 facets of genre. The fact that the law is embedded in narrative, the fact that it is linked to treaty and to covenant in its form, the fact that it has apodictic laws, and then the fact that the 10 Commandments as a genre really are unique, not just distinctive, in ancient Israel. So the first one, the law of Moses is embedded in narrative. Now, I've been asking you to read the Pentateuch. I hope you've been doing that. Let's just turn to the book of Exodus. I'm not going to read anything right away from Exodus, but I want you just to turn some pages with me, all right? We're trying to get a large view of things, so turning pages and looking at pages is part of the game. If you just look at Exodus chapter 1, you know that it's about their being oppressed, and chapter 2 is more oppression, and chapter 3 is Moses at the burning bush, and chapter 4 is Moses still being called, and chapter 5 he goes back, and chapter 6 God says he's going to bring a mighty act of justice, and then chapter 7, chapter 8, chapter 9, chapter 10, chapter 12, up to that, we got the plagues, right? God is smashing the power of Egypt and freeing them. Chapter 12 and chapter 13 and chapter 14 and chapter 15, they're crossing the Red Sea and they're remembering what happened through the Passover and through the Song of Moses. And then chapter 16, they start moving. It's a journey. And they moving along to Sinai from Egypt. So 16, 17, 18, 19, they arrive at Mount Sinai. Chapter 20 is the chapter we all know. It's the 10 Commandments, isn't it? You see that? Chapter 20 is the 10 Commandments. At the end of the 10 Commandments, there's a bit of talk about one thing and another. And then chapter 21, 22, and 23 are a list of laws. If so-and-so happens, then do that. Called the Book of the Covenant. So we have the 10 Commandments, then we have the Book of the Covenant, then chapter 24 We have the covenant confirmed, which is a story about how they do that. And then chapter 25 starts a long, and I dare say tedious discourse for us about the tabernacle and where all these things go. And you're going along through the middle of all this, and all of a sudden, right in the middle of the thing, Moses comes down the mountain, and Israel has made calves. And you have this story in chapter 32 about the golden calves. It interrupts, as it were, the instructions about the tabernacle. Now, it's not quite so clear in Exodus, you begin to get the flavor here, but when you read the book of Numbers, and I've outlined the book of Numbers here for you, you go a little ways, you stop, and then laws are given. You go a little ways, you stop, and then laws are given. You go a little ways, you stop, and laws are given. So it's very clear and very important that in terms of genre, that the law of Moses is embedded in narrative. It's not like the Code of Hammurabi that is freestanding and independent and has no narrative connection. It has an epilogue in which Hammurabi tells you essentially what a wonderful and just king he is. Not everybody believes that. And it has a prologue, and then it has an epilogue at the end, which is more of the same. But it's not narrative. The story is not going anywhere. In the Pentateuch, the story is literally moving from place to place. They're going somewhere. They're going from Egypt to Canaan. They're on their way. And as they are traveling along, didn't you ever take your children on a journey? Huh? And as you drove along, you stopped the car and you read them story? Did you do that? We read the whole of Tolkien on the way to Montana and back. You need to go to Montana and back to read the whole of Tolkien, don't you? Yeah. To get 2,000 pages of reading in, you've got to leave Minnesota and go to Montana and take it slow. And every so often we would stop and pull out Tolkien, and Dolores would read for an hour or two while the kids listened. Then we'd close the book, get back in the car, and drive on. That's sort of the way the law of Moses is. You journey, and then you get laws given, so they are embedded in the narrative. If you're following in the notes, I hope you are, I'm on page 2. Now, what's the significance of that? What's the significance of that? I think the significance is that God has acted in the narrative. When we get to the Ten Commandments, we don't plunge directly into the Ten Commandments. We'll start with the very top of the Ten Commandments, and the first word of the Ten Commandments, which I'm sure you know, but I will remind you, is not you shall have no other gods, but the first word of the Ten Commandments is, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. Number 1, you shall have no other gods. So the beginning of the Ten Commandments is a rehearsal of the great narrative event of the Exodus, a justice event. God has put his hand in space-time history and has acted in narrative as a just God. And then he comes and asks his children to act justly. He has set for them an example first in the story. Are you with me? So the motivation and the modeling of justice has already happened in the storyline. The Exodus was a great justice event. God did justice on behalf of the poor and needy, who he knew would also be stiff-necked and stubborn, and brought them out of Egypt. And then he says to us, I want you to behave the same way. Now, I'm not going to read very much Bible to you today, and for that I feel sorry and apologize, but turn with me to Deuteronomy chapter 24. I know you're religious and you brought your Bibles today, so please turn with me to Deuteronomy chapter 24 and verse 17, where God says, and we're listening now to see how narrative and law link, do not deprive the alien or the fatherless of justice. It's a strong term, it's mishpat. Or take the cloak of the widow as a pledge. Why not? Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you from there. This is why I command you to do this. Why should you be kind to those who are on the margins? Why should you do justice to those who are oppressed? Because I did that. And how do you know that? You know that from the narrative. Right? Let's read on a bit. When you're harvesting in your field and you overlook a sheaf, do not go back to get it. Leave it for the alien, the fatherless, and the widow. And of course the alien, the fatherless, and the widow, and sometimes the Levites also thrown in, isn't it, are the people who have no land. Which in traditional terms means they're the people who have no assets. They are people who are dependent people. They have no land, and usually alien, fatherless, widow have no kin. Now, the Levites would have kin, but otherwise these are the people without the two basic properties that make life bearable in a traditional society. A bit of land and kin. And alien, father, and widow have neither of those. So, leave it for the alien, the fatherless, and the widow, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. When you beat the olives from the trees, do not go over the branches a second time. Leave what remains for the alien, the fatherless, and the widow. When you harvest the grapes in your vineyard, do not go over the vines again. Leave what remains for the alien, the fatherless, and the widow. Why? Why should you do that? Remember that you were slaves in Egypt. That is why I command you to do this. Do you make the connection? You should be kind to people who are in dire need and oppressed and at the bottom of the pile, because when you were at the bottom of the pile, God was kind to you. God was just to you. God was good to you. Act like I acted in the narrative. Now, let me just pause and say, as an evangelical, I grew up thinking that you got doctrine from Paul, and you got ethics from Paul, and you might just go and read the Sermon on the Mount, although you had to be careful. Right? All the rest of the story stuff was for Sunday school children and flannel graph. Well, we don't have flannel graph anymore, which is a great loss. But what about the stories? I mean, it's Brother Paul who will say to us, these stories were written for your good, upon whom have come the ends of the world. And evangelicals are just now beginning to discover that ethics are embedded in narrative. That you don't just use didactic material, Pauline letters, Sermon on the Mount, maybe something from the Old Testament, but with great care, huh? No, you use the story. That the story itself is a teaching device. And that we're meant to learn from the story both the modeling and the motivation that comes from the story. So I commend the stories to you. Well, we won't read Deuteronomy 15:15, but you can see more of the same there. The law of Moses contains lists like those in the ancient Near East codes, but the difference is that the lists are part of treaty stipulations that are in covenant. Now, I'm not sure how to draw this. I'm a bit short on ideas about how to draw this, but God, in Exodus chapter 24, comes to Israel and he says, I'm giving you my laws. And the laws function as stipulations in a treaty. And God is making this covenant with all Israel. Now, treaties were not unknown in the ancient Near East. In fact, it's the Hittite treaties from the second millennium that are informative here, and we won't talk about them today, but in a later period we will spend a good deal of time talking about Hittite treaties and how they reflect or inform us of the structure of Deuteronomy and give meaning to the text in that way. But here we have God who in Hittite tradition would be the great king. And if we were over in the Hittite territory, the great king would be making the treaty with a vassal king, that is a lower king. What is radical here, and I just mentioned it today and I will unpack it later, what is radical here is that God is making a treaty with all Israel. Do you smell the fuse burning on that stick of dynamite? That is an incredible insight. God makes the treaty with all Israel. And we'll talk about the political, social, economic, and religious implications of that. I'll sketch them out a little bit today, and we'll develop them as we go along. The treaty stipulations, which are the law, are spelled out in that law, and they are that. When you're over here, this list of laws that the Code of Hammurabi is not a treaty with anybody, certainly not with the Mesopotamians. So God, Moses, Deuteronomy have radically reworked the idea of treaty and covenant, and while they're using elements known in the ancient Near East, they have radically reworked them to give them a very different sense. So at this point in terms of genre, we just simply need to note that the lists, although the lists are the same, they are in entirely different contextual settings. Can I say that again? Although the lists are similar, and when you come to the ox, they're identical. Right? Although the lists are similar and in some points identical, the context in which they are set are radically different. The law of Moses is set here as this is the covenant that God makes with Israel, the so-called Sinai covenant or the covenant of Moses, whatever you want to call it, and he makes it with all Israel. Then the laws are seen as stipulations of the treaty which are to be obeyed, and we'll talk a bit more about those as we go along. Another thing to note about the genre of the law is that the law of Moses contains, and I'm simply using the technical term so as not to invent another term, apodictic laws, which are set over against casuistic laws, or I would prefer to call them case study laws, a little bit more pronounceable and memorable. But you've got two kinds of law: apodictic, you shall or you shall not, and case study, if so-and-so happens, then you do so-and-so, right? The laws in Mesopotamia are almost entirely case study laws. If you took time to read through the Code of Hammurabi, and if you haven't done that yet, you want to do that just before bedtime. It'll put you sound asleep, and you'll sleep firmly. But read through, they're case studies. If a man, kills, and then you get all these kinds of, and the Old Testament has those too. But what the Old Testament has that is very rarely found in Mesopotamian laws is apodictic laws. You shall and you shall not. And that leads me to the fourth little piece down here under genre, and that is that the Ten Commandments, 10, or really it's 13 or 14, we'll talk about this, apodictic statements put together in a structured form, and these actually do have structure to them, is absolutely unique in the ancient Near East. There's nothing like it. Can I say that again? It's unique. And to say it's unique, I'm skating out on thin ice and I can hear it cracking. But I've read and read and read on this, and as far as I can tell, while there are apodictic laws, there's no Ten Commandments in the ancient Near East. And that seems to be a set of what we would call in modern terms value statements. And then what happens is those value statements in the rest of the Mosaic law are worked out in case studies. So, you shall not murder. But then you get the case, what if a man is out in the woods chopping with an axe and the head flies off and he kills his neighbor, and what do you do with that kind of situation? You follow? So you've got a number of cases about kinds of murders or apparent killings that might be murders that happen. And I follow the line of argument that you have the Ten Commandments, and then especially in the book of Deuteronomy, but maybe also in the covenant code, that the case studies work out the central core of values that you have in the apodictic statements of the Ten Commandments. Are you still awake? All right, well, we got through this part. That's the genre part, all right? Now, another part that's really quite different is the authorship of the law. Who authored the law? Who gave the law? All right? And I'm going to read from you the standard translation of the Code of Hammurabi by Roth. And she reads the opening of the Code of Hammurabi this way. It's the last 4 lines just before you get to the case studies. And here's what Hammurabi says on his stele. I just simply should say that these steles were widespread. Of course, the one that we're reading from was taken away from where it belonged and is now in Paris. You know that a lot of these good things were moved, weren't they? I won't say stolen, but they were moved to other places, and some of them have been moved home. But this one is in Paris. But there are many copies of it, and it's a very widespread one. It says, when the god Marduk, and he would have been the chief god, there were many gods, polytheistic situation, when the god Marduk commanded me to provide just ways for the people of the land in order to attain appropriate behavior, I, Hammurabi, the great king, I established truth and justice as the declaration of the land. I enhanced the well-being of the people. Now, before I make my point, let me just state the obvious. Hammurabi is concerned with justice. The comparison is not Moses was concerned with justice and Hammurabi wasn't. No. That's entirely wrong. Hammurabi was passionate about justice. It's just that his justice is quite different than one we find in the law of Moses, all right? But they both talk justice. And when we move to Egypt, the central organizing, underlying value in the culture of Egypt is ma'at, which is variously translated order, stability, justice. It's a little elusive to get hold of. But again, it's about Egypt. So it's not as if Egypt and Mesopotamia weren't concerned about justice. They are. The question is, what kind of justice was promulgated? All right? Now, my point here is that Hammurabi very clearly says, I gave the law. I gave the law. When you look at the stele, it's about 7 feet tall. At the top, you have the god of justice, Shamash, offering to Hammurabi the symbols, apparently, of kingship. It's a little tricky to interpret exactly what the picture means. But I don't think it means that God was giving the law. It simply means that God was authenticating Hammurabi as the law giver, because here he says, I give the law. Now, when we come to Israel, we're going to have an entirely different situation. Right? We're going to have Moses saying, God gave the law, and I was simply his scribe in this sense. But now, before we go on to Mesopotamia, I want to read slowly to you a very difficult paragraph on Egypt. Are you ready? This is the worst of it. If you get through this, we're home free, all right? So let me just read this to you. Egypt is different from Mesopotamia in that Egypt did not produce lists of laws. Now, maybe somebody will be digging away and they'll discover lists of laws and we'll have to rewrite this whole paragraph. So be it, all right? But up till now, nobody's discovered a list of laws like you have in Mesopotamia. And there are multiple lists of laws in Mesopotamia, at least 8 or 9 major codes. I've only mentioned one, but there are others. However, Egypt was definitely concerned with justice, that is, ma'at. This is not the place to unpack the concept of ma'at. A scholar, an Egyptian scholar, as far as I know, he's not a Christian, I really don't know if he is, but he's an Egyptologist, he's not a biblical scholar. Jan Assmann, who recently published The Price of Monotheism, says this: and he's published extensively on Ma'at. Unfortunately, it's all in German. He argues that religion and ethics, and you might want to put a little parenthesis behind that and say laws, because when we're talking about ethics, we're talking about laws, that religion and ethics in Egypt were separate spheres, and that Ma'at, justice, relates to ethics and not religion. Let me see if I can draw that for you. That what he is saying is that in Egypt, as distinct from the Bible, I guess I got my chart set up, I can do this. That in Egypt, as distinct from the Bible, that you would have the gods, and then over here you would have ethics, and you would have law. That religion is over here with the God and the temples, and over here in a different compartment is ethics and law. All right? Now, Asmund asserts, I missed a sentence. Therefore, the idea that a God would give laws, ethics, was a new departure. The gods did not give laws. Asmund asserts in relation to the Lord's giving the law that the world had not previously known a law-giving God. Now, isn't that interesting? Isn't that worth the price of the book, huh? Yeah, I bought this book sort of on the fly a couple weeks ago, and it arrived day before yesterday, and I sat down and read most of it, or part of it at least, and I thought, whew, I got my money's worth out of this book. Let me read that sentence to you again. That sentence made me happy for the whole day. All right? Let me read it to you again. The world has not previously known a law-giving God. The gods of the ancient Near East are judges. You see that from the Egyptian Book of the Dead. All right? But they are not lawgivers. As a result, he, God, competes with the king on his own terrain, usurping his position and unseating him from the throne of sovereign legislative royalty. So it was the king that gave laws. But in the biblical world, God is giving laws. So you see that God is taking the place of the king. He's usurping the power of the king. Now, it's too bad we're all Americans and have grown up with a president, all right? I mean, God bless the king and the queen. If we'd grown up in England, we would at least known about a queen, right? And had some sense of kings and queens. And of course, the whole world has always lived with kings and queens, right? I mean, it's just us Americans, and I guess the Canadians too, although they sort of have the queen, don't they? But it's only us Americans and the Aussies. Well, they sort of have a queen too. But it's really only us Americans who don't have a king and a queen. And we're happy about that, aren't we? Yeah. Everybody else knows about this except us. So let's follow this through because it's dynamite. The world had not previously known a law-giving God. The gods of the ancient Near East are judges, but they are not lawgivers. As a result, he, God, competes with the king on his own terrain, usurping his position, lawgiver, and unseating him from the throne of sovereign legislative royalty. With the result that this type of dominion, the human king giving laws, no longer has a place within the horizon of biblical monotheism. Monotheism's achievement was not to have introduced law and justice. I mean, Hammurabi knew about law and justice. Monotheism didn't bring law and justice into the world. We already see that in the Code of Hammurabi. But to have, here's the difference that makes, but monotheism has transferred them, the law and justice, from the earth and human experience as a source of law to heaven and the divine will. So that ethics and law over here are human, and over here is God and religion, which is divine. But when you move across to the Bible, God has crossed the line and he's giving laws. He's acting as if he is king. And indeed he is, isn't he? And then Assman draws a very logical inference from that, and that is, if God is king, you don't need another king, do you? Now, let me just put a footnote in and say, reading from within the story, the worst mistake that Israel ever made in its long history was to ask for a king. And that's absolutely clear in 1 Samuel 8 through 12. The only problem is you read the Bible backwards. And because you think Jesus is a king, and of course he is, you think kings are good things, don't you? And so you read that back into the Old Testament. But if you're reading from within the story and you come to the king, Samuel shouts to Israel, don't do this. And when they finally do it, he says, I will pray that God will forgive you for your sin of asking for a king. 1 Samuel chapter 12. It's very plain. Very plain. So, I mean, he's saying that here from a little outside. Now, let me read one more sentence here from Assman, this one that's indented. Assman ends his section on law and morality in the pagan world and theologizing of justice and monotheism with this astounding assertion. By theologizing the law, making it a matter of divine rather than human making, God gives the laws rather than the human king, and elevating it to the status of divine law, monotheism freed people from the illusion that without a king to dispense them justice, they would be at one another's throats. If you get rid of the king, all chaos will break loose. Now, I'm tempted to go and talk about the Middle East and certain things, but I'm going to resist the temptation because you can go there by yourself, can't you? And people are worried that if you remove the king, or the dictator who's made himself the king, that all trouble will break loose, right? And he's saying, no, if God's the king, then you don't need to be afraid of people being at one another's throat. With that, the hitherto unquestioned alliance of justice and the state and kingship and salvation comes to an end. That by God breaking in, the relation of king to ethics, to law, to state has been broken, and now it's God giving the laws. I hope you followed that. I mean, I hope somebody in this room is interested in jurisprudence, right? I know that we have a few lawyers in this room, at least 5 or 6, huh? I have discovered, and I say this carefully and tongue-in-cheek, it's interesting. I asked a lot of lawyers before I started this class, how was your class in justice at law school? And without exception, every lawyer that I asked said, including my father, I never had such a class. Law school does not teach justice. And you ask the lawyer sitting next to you, and there's one almost at every table, if they studied justice. And the answer is no, not in law school. So what we're trying to do here is to think about a biblical foundation for jurisprudence. And I will introduce you to a couple brand new books written by evangelicals on that topic in time to come. Now, I had thought we'd get a little farther. Let me just simply say something about Israel, and then we'll stop there because I've gone quite a while already. Israel. In Israel, the Lord gives the law, not Moses. God is the author. Moses is the spokesman and writer. The beginning of the 10 words says, and God spoke all these words. Moses simply mediates between the people and the Lord in the giving the law. Moses is not the author of the law, even though we often speak of the law of Moses, don't we? Or the Mosaic law, which is not quite right. The divine authorship of the law in the Pentateuch has wide-ranging implications, and I'm going to try to outline a few of them. Let me just simply say, it is even said about the Ten Commandments in Exodus 31:18 that he wrote them with his finger. You get absolutely nothing like that in the ancient Near East. Absolutely nothing like that. And that just makes it doubly emphatic that the law is from Yahweh God, and in that sense is divine.